Happy day and welcome to Independent Guåhan's May General Assembly. Before we get started, I'd like to welcome all of us to recite the Inifresi. Actually, before we get into the Inifresi, I'll go ahead and go back to the agenda. Thank you so much. I'd love to also welcome my co-host, Dr. Franci Napati, who is so gracefully handling our slides today and prepared this wonderful slide presentation for you. We'll start with the Inifresi and some welcoming remarks, and then go into our topic today about body sovereignty, and then wrap up and see you again next month. So let's go ahead and start with the Inifresi. Inifresi. Gineni mastakilo gihinasoku, imastakalum gikurasonhu, zani masfigu nanina sinyahu, hu ofresen maisazu parabaihu protehi, zenhu defendi, ihinengi, ikotura, ilenguahi, airi, hanum, Taitano Chamoru. Ni irenshaku riretsu ginenasu ustata. Esti hua fitma gihilu I Biblia zani banderahu I banderan Guåhan. Siddus Masiti, and welcome again. Guahu si Victoria Lola Leon Guerrero, and I am the co-chairperson for the Educational Development and Research Committee of Independent Guåhan. For those of you who may be tuning in for the first time to an Independent Guåhan General Assembly or event, Independent Guåhan empowers the Chamorro people to reclaim our sovereignty as a nation. Inspired by the strength of our ancestors and with love for future generations, we educate and unify all who call our island home to build a sustainable and prosperous independent future. Independent Guåhan has been hosting monthly General Assemblies for the last 6 years. We originally had hosted these live at the Chamorro Village and hope to bring that back very soon as our island's restrictions because of the pandemic are lessening. But currently we have been holding our General Assemblies online since the pandemic and have been really excited to do so, as it's allowed us to have wonderful conversations that have spanned borders during this really difficult time. So welcome. I'd like to turn it over to my co-chairperson, Dr. Franci Napati, who will give you a sense of what Independent Guåhan has been up to.
And thank you for that. I want to share some updates with us briefly before we get into our topic for today. The first one is, you may have heard that Guhab Mona is a self-determination study for Guam. It's a really amazing compilation of research about various different issues pertaining to Guam's political status options. And so you can actually download this for free. It is available at the Commission on Decolonization's website, decol.guam.gov. And you can also pick it up for a free copy. Currently, they're at the Guam Museum, and they'll soon be distributed at different places, such as your local public library and other places around the island. This book is a very comprehensive study. I actually have a full thick copy of it here. It's a volume that can be used as a resource and a guide for self-determination to look at the different issues that contain, whether international or domestic, or even just options for negotiation, all these different types of issues pertaining to the island's political status options. So we really encourage people to check it out on the website, and it's the first study of its kind. Some of our contributors on this webinar today have actually participated in various ways to bring this study together, and it was a labor of lots of work and love and dedication. So we just really want to encourage people to check that out. It's another way to educate our people about the political status options. And if you haven't also been keeping up with Fanatsu, just last week there was an episode, and we have one coming up tomorrow, but I wanted to do a shout out briefly to the one that was most recently from last week, because our own Annie Faye Camacho from the Independent Guåhan led this one, and this one was particularly focusing on a panel of different folks to talk about mental health and mental health professionals during that Mental Health Awareness Month. But just tomorrow, if you have a chance, June 1st, 12 p.m. Guam time, you can check out this week's episode of Fanatsu. I don't have an image of it for you here, but you will be able to see more art and understand it if you check out Fanatsu's social media page. It's an episode that's featuring the musician, painter, and carver, Senor Rich Manglonia from the beautiful island of Luta. So if you get a chance to tune in tomorrow to Fanatsu, you will get to see and hear more about that. Oops. And let's see here. looks like I hit my screen. So let me just pause this. I apologize. I think my last little bit of information, I think that was it actually. So I'll go ahead and sorry about that. Turn it over to you. Again, Victoria Lola, one of the things I did want to shout out is just that we've been doing a lot of things. And even though we are in a virtual space, we have a lot to share today. And so we want to get right back into it. Thanks so much.
Siddus Masiti, Tiara. So without further ado, I'm excited to welcome our Maga'taotao today. Independent Guåhan, as part of our General Assembly, tackles a different topic every month that has to do with decolonization and independence, or in some cases, topics that are relevant and important to our community in the moment. And how do these topics connect to our colonization and the need for independence and sovereignty? And so over the last couple months, Independent Guåhan has actually wanted to focus very specifically on sovereignty, which, as we know, is the ability to make choices for ourselves, right? So last month, we looked at land sovereignty, and today we wanted to talk about body sovereignty. And who better to do this than Dr. Taitano Delisle? We chose to honor Dr. Delisle as a Maga'taotao today. We select our Maga'taotao or heroes in our community every month to pay tribute to those who have always been strong and bold voices for decolonization, and particularly who can illuminate something about a topic that we may not have thought of before, give us sort of a path forward in our quest for independence. And so we are really excited and honored to have Dr. Taitano Delisle as our Maga'taotao, because she truly has dedicated her life and her career to capturing the stories of our women and our people in many spaces, and kind of informing not just our community, but the world of many of our struggles. Dr. Delisle is an associate professor of American Indian Studies at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities, where she teaches courses in critical Indigenous studies, global comparative Native studies, and Indigenous feminisms. Her book, Placental Politics, Chamorro Women, White Womanhood, and Indigeneity in Guam, was released by UNC Press in 2021 and actually had a local launch just this month, and offers an Indigenous feminist critique of the historical and cultural work of Chamorro women in relation to the imperial labor and philanthropy of American women stationed in Guam in the early 20th century. Her current project examines the contested sites of heritage and conservation in museums, national parks, and national monuments in Micronesia. She is also co-editor with Maori historian Nepia Mahuika and Australian Indigenous scholar Lorena Barker of a book on Indigenous oral histories, which is forthcoming with Routledge Press. Before joining academia, Dr. Delisle served as a researcher and writer for Speaker Jyoti San Augustine and later Guam's Political Status Education Coordinating Commission. Her public history work also includes co-producing with Dr. Vince Diaz a film on traditional Micronesian seafaring, and co-producing with Karen Cruz a film on pre-war Patera or midwives. Dr. Delisle has also worked with Humanities Guåhan on their literary and civic engagement projects concerning the U.S. military buildup, and Humanities Guåhan's recent Kuntusi Itanu series. A daughter of Guåhan, Dr. Delisle hails from Jigu of the Liberatu Cabeza and Nungi Asen clans, and is the granddaughter, the eldest of 22 grandchildren of the late Juan Guerrero Taitano and late Maria Castro San Nicolas Taitano of Jigu. Half a day and welcome, Dr. Tina Delisle.
Undangkala na Siddus Masiti para todo Hanzu. I'm so honored by this invitation. I want to, my presentation today draws on research from the recent book to explore the concept and politics of body sovereignty. Body sovereignty, and more specifically, Indigenous women's body sovereignty, is of course not mutually exclusive from other forms of Indigenous sovereignty, be they political, cultural, intellectual, or ideological. Body sovereignty is not mutually exclusive from food sovereignty, land sovereignty, or even visual sovereignty. But it is also a very specific and distinct political project of insisting and protecting the legitimacy and right of a person to determine and to control the terms of their own body, something that should be, but is not always in sync with the other more common ideas of indigenous political sovereignty projects. Now, just to be clear, I understand indigenous sovereignty not as a type of sovereignty utilized by modern nation states. For many of us, that's a given. But surprisingly, I find that people still think of this in terms of the US of A and other modern nation states. So I want to be clear about that. Indigenous sovereignty, not as the type of sovereignty utilized by modern nation states or an exclusive term that's used to claim power over bounded territories, but rather a concept of self-determination with mutual respect for all other nations, especially marginalized communities. What I want to do today is really two things. First, and for most of my presentation, I want to highlight some of the historical and colonial violence against Chamorro women, against Chamorro women's bodies and body sovereignty, and Chamorro women's efforts to assert, maintain, and protect other Chamorro women's body sovereignty. In the book, I examined the historical and cultural legacy of Chamorro women who, in confronting the gendered landscapes of colonialism, and really through, obviously through the work of Navy wives, how Chamorro women worked hard to steward and protect Chamorro lands and bodies in Maulic terms. In the book, I argue that even within the gendered landscape of 20th century US colonialism, Chamorro women experienced new mobilities and freedoms. Sovereignty and freedom, of course, are not the same, but they're also not mutually exclusive. So how Chamorro women experienced new mobilities and freedoms from colonial, as well as indigenous patriarchal prescriptions around gender and proper place, while articulating new forms of womanhood and inafat malik, a state or condition in which goodness is achieved and is constantly being reworked. In the book, I'm also interested in what indigenous feminist theorizing and historicizing of colonialism might offer Chamorro decolonization and sovereignty, and the repatriation of indigenous land and life, especially in the context of hyper-militarization that's happening now, and the destruction of Chamorro homelands in the Marianas, and also within the larger frameworks of neoliberal capitalism, neoliberal conservation. And we can look at the designation of the Marianas Trench as an example of that, but also alt-right, ultra-right conservatism. Secondly, so I should also add that, even in the book, I don't couch this work as body sovereignty per se, but the book is really steeped in the struggles for political and cultural sovereignty. And again, thinking about how these different forms of indigenous sovereignty are not mutually exclusive. So clearly, it is also about, the book is also really interested in these stories about women protecting bodies and body sovereignty. What I want to do toward the end of my presentation is, for a couple of minutes, maybe the last 5 minutes, beginning to think about the implications of these earlier forms of violence against women's bodies, the regulation of Chamorro women's bodies, and the work of Famalawan Chamorro, the work that they carried out to protect body sovereignty against some of the new forms of what we're seeing now, some of the new forms of colonialism and violence and attacks, clear attacks on body sovereignty. Can I have the next slide, please? Shortly after its arrival in Guåhan in 1899, the US Navy began an aggressive campaign to change the fabric of Chamorro society to, and I quote here from a US Navy report that was published retrospectively about the project, to transform, literally, to transform the minds and bodies of Chamorros. A good place to begin to really examine the numerous, a good place to begin here is to really take stock of the numerous edicts handed down by several of the naval governors. And I start here with General Order number 5, which is first Governor of Guam, Richard Leary, Leary's ban on Chamorro cohabitation, and what he referred to as concubinage. And I'm going to read this, right? The rearing of illegitimate children, which reflected a broader mission to control Chamorro sociality and sexuality regarded as antithetical to decency, morale, advancement, and civilized society. The existing custom of concubinage, rearing of families of illegitimate children, is repulsive to ideas of decency, antagonistic to moral advancement, incompatible with the generally recognized customs of civilized society, a violation of the accepted principles of Christianity, and a most degrading injustice to the innocent offspring who is not responsible for the conditions of his unfortunate existence. Leary's directives also reflected a paternal and patriarchal naval brand of the benevolent civilizing mission, which saw itself as having the well-earned reputation of championing the needs of the distressed and, quote unquote, protecting the honor and virtue of women. And this is actually the idea of protecting the virtue, the honor and virtue of women. This patriarchal sensibility really comes straight out of another one of Governor Leary's general orders, General Order number 11. In the Navy's efforts to regulate, control, assimilate, and make adaptable Chamorro women. And adaptable is a word that the Navy used often when talking about trying to assimilate. They talked often about women's adaptability to assimilate to the colonial projects of public health, public works, and public education. So in the Navy's effort to regulate, control, assimilate, and make adaptable Chamorro women, the Navy actively recruited certain Chamorro women who the Navy redeemed as being pliable and adaptable to work as nurse midwives and teachers. The Natfafanyagu, or the Patera, or nurse midwife, and the Fafanyagwi, the teachers and the educators, were among the first women who were interpolated or hailed into the Navy's colonial projects of public health and public education. Next slide, please. Now, General Order number 28, and this was an edict handed down by Governor Seton Schroeder, the second naval governor of the island, was another example of a really big assault on Chamorro women's body sovereignty. And it came when the Navy implemented a system that regulated and usurped the power of older Chamorro Patera, or the lay midwives, as the Navy would refer to them, by requiring them to become licensed. But first they had to undergo instruction with the Navy, and they had to do this in English. It was also, what it also required was the constant badgering of women to avail themselves to the Navy, to bring themselves, their bodies, to avail themselves before Navy doctors. And it often relied on the younger nurse-trained midwives who were being recruited precisely to usurp, right, and replace the older lay midwives. So it often relied on the Navy, the younger nurse-trained midwives, to to get Chamorro women to avail themselves. Something else to consider here in terms of, you could think of this competing body sovereignty really is when the Navy, by virtue of doing this, the Navy was also causing tensions between the older Patera and the younger Patera. The older Patera essentially being the Sina of the younger Patera. Next slide, please. I want to draw your attention to this image. Many of you have probably seen this image. It's an offshoot image of the lay Chamorro Patera taken in 1902. But what I want to really emphasize here is the facial expressions on these women's bodies. This is 2 years after the Navy implements the licensing of midwives and is requiring them to undergo instruction in English. So I really wanted to just highlight the facial expression of the older lay Patera in this photograph. To recap here, there are different levels of surveillance and regulation of Chamorro bodies and Chamorro women's mobilities and body sovereignty happening here. Unmarried couples in Leary's bill on concubinage, Patera, the lay midwives, the younger nurse-trained Patera, other healers like the Surahano and the Surahana for that matter, pregnant women and Chamorro women. And not just under US colonialism, mind you, but Spanish Catholic Costumbrin Chamorro that at the same time is tightening the reins because of the new spaces that are opened up under US colonialism, especially in the way that these new spaces afford close proximity to foreign white American men. Next image, please. I want to draw your attention to another form of control of Chamorro women's body sovereignty. So many of us have seen these images of Chamorro nurses in the archives, in the history books. Something seemingly innocuous or harmless on the one hand, right? But really, this moment of putting women in uniform, Chamorro brown bodies in uniform, in 1916, the Guam newsletter would hail this, the uniform on women as yet another milestone when Native nurse midwives were put in uniform or in uniformity. Literally and figuratively, the image of dark-skinned, white-capped nurses who were often paraded along the island's capital, as you see here. This is during one of the during a Guam Industrial Fair in 1917, bringing them to uniformed conformity with the United States and to standardize and establish an order based on marks of simplicity, correctness, cleanliness, and neatness. The wearing of uniforms, of course, in schools and elsewhere is most straightforwardly related to what French philosopher Michel Foucault, what he theorizes as disciplinary power, and even the panopticism to the extent of the way the uniform becomes a way of self-regulating. Looking over the letters of American Navy nurses who describe the training of Native nurses, one gets a glimpse of how the nursing schools, the Native nursing schools, were heteropatriarchal and heteronormative spaces. The emphasis here, and this is after reading some of the letters by American Navy nurses, the emphasis here is placed on the fact that after training and graduation, the Native nurses would receive the highest social status a Native woman could receive. And because of this training and status, this newfound status as a nurse, the Native woman, the Native nurses rather, would inevitably be, quote unquote, well prepared for marriage, a status that in turn elevated civic life. Now, the story here is one of the control and regulation of women's bodies and the attack on Chamorro women's body sovereignty. But I also don't want to lose sight. In fact, the book is very much about insisting on Native women reworking the terms of colonialism, and this is where I get this idea of a placental politics. It draws directly from how the Patera, refusing the Navy's orders to burn or discard the baby's placenta, would actually continue to bury the placenta for what it meant to Chamorro communities, what it symbolized. And that was really seen as a way of protecting the child from birth all the way into adulthood. In their reworking of the terms of colonialism, the Patera allowed a certain degree of women's bodily autonomy. And I say a certain because it was also doing the work and the bidding of the Navy, but it was also massaging that, right? Those spaces in between the Navy and Chamorro society. It was also allowing them to seek out the health of the Patera. It would tell them, for example, get your prenatal checkup. When everything checks out good, I'm going to be able to come and deliver the baby for you. And I'm going to come and take care of you. In their working of the terms of colonialism, the Patera would be able to deliver in the comfort, the babies in the comfort of women's homes. And also one thing that they helped to do was to help women avoid the stigma that was associated, the Navy stigma of having illegitimate children. And in their working of the terms of colonialism, the Patera were also able to incorporate new systems of health under the Navy without necessarily abandoning old Chamorro ways, Chamorro, the Lasa or massage, and other Chamorro practices and beliefs that were seen as maulik or good for Chamorro bodies, for women, babies, and their communities. In their work of symbolic and discursive massaging, the Patera could be counted on to assist unwed women during their pregnancies, to advise them and their partners on matters pertaining to sexuality and to support them even in their decisions not to marry. How am I doing on time? About 5 more minutes I have? Is that right? So can I have the next slide, please? I want to show this image. It's actually, in this image is, well, to the far left is Maria Aguero, or better known as Tan Maria Ndogi, is one of the very prominent older midwives that some of the midwives many of the midwives I interviewed in the 1990s knew very well, and she was beloved. Tan Maria Ndogi, actually, I should say, is sister to my great grandmother on my mother's father's side. Now, the interesting thing about Tan Maria Ndogi, and this is something I discovered in Thompson's field notes, Laura Thompson, who did the first ethnography of Guam and the Chamorros, was that she was a Red Cross nurse. So she was a Patera, but also a Red Cross nurse. Some of these women, their duties also were very closely associated with she wasn't known as a Suruhana, but she also was very familiar with some of the Amat Chamorro for women, for problemen famalawan, women's problems with either orgasm or wanting to have babies. So she was confided in. This is something that I discovered in some of the oral histories, as well as Laura Thompson's field notes. She was confided in by a lot of the women around the island. And she also assisted women during their pregnancies, but she also advised them and their partners on matters pertaining to sexuality, and even supported them in their decisions not to marry. And this, of course, happening under the radar of the Catholic Church. She was especially, she was also known to teach about sex and birth control, and shared her knowledge about certain Amat Chamorro. Indeed, some Patera Suruhana assisted women in having traditional forms of sovereignty over their bodies. The preparation and application of Amat Palak could also help women who had trouble achieving having sexual orgasms. Privy to this kind of information that was skillfully withheld from the American doctors, Patera were able to work at the comfort level of Chamorro women without sacrificing what was in their mutual best interests, a safe and healthy delivery, or in some instances, good advice and practice for safe sex or a safe termination of pregnancy. So another example that I mentioned was, and the more obvious example of safeguarding body sovereignty, was the nurse's insistence on burying the placenta. I want to move quickly to thinking about the way that Chamorro teachers like Taitano Johnson, a subject of one of my chapters in the book, was how Chamorro teachers were also subjugated to Navy monitoring and surveillance. Chamorro teachers were, like Patera, were required to do their own surveillance, and teachers were required to inculcate American style education and quote unquote cheerfully and harmoniously cooperate with the teachers of English in this regard. And this is something that appears in one of the other general orders issued by Governor Leary. And I think that this is really interesting if you think about not only this implementation of a colonial system, but requiring teachers to cheerfully and harmoniously cooperate with the American teachers. Now, what does that begin to look like when you're beginning to survey Chamorro teachers? Now, like the stories of the Patera, the stories of the teachers, and in particular here, I'm talking about Taitano Johnson, there are these, the story here that I'm trying to really drive home the point about is the way that Chamorro women are able to work the terms of colonialism in ways that are beneficial to Chamorro well-being, to Chamorro bodies, and really to Chamorro self-determination and sovereignty. And I would say individual Chamorro women's bodies, body sovereignty. So one of the stories I want to share with regard to Taitano Johnson is a story that is told by Reverend Joaquin Sablan. And this is sometime after the war. It has to do with a Chamorro woman who was found guilty of wartime prostitution and shorn of her hair and forced to sweep the streets of Hagåtña in the hot sun. The woman collapses, and looking at this in very deep Tadung ways and her asserting her role as a godmother, but also Maga'taotao, Johnson confronts the governor, who informs her that it's really a Chamorro priest who recommended the punishment. And then not only does she chide the American governor, but Johnson also marches over to the convento, to the convent, and demands that the pali malik, or make or correct or make good, make things right. One of the other stories that we don't hear about Taitano Johnson is, and this is really, it comes out in her unpublished writings, is her efforts to, and this causes tensions between her and her American husband, William Johnson, but her efforts to really keep children steeped in the Chamorro language. I'm going to say, what I want to do is end now thinking, my final point here is thinking about these earlier histories of usurping women's power, controlling and regulating women's body, controlling the terms of Chamorro women's body sovereignty. I want an important indigenous feminist intervention is to really begin to think about the linkage between how colonialism engenders and sexualizes the landscape and indigenous women's bodies. One of the lessons in this history in placental politics is how we need to be aware of not only how these things operate, but we need to really scrutinize how Chamorro culture and society, how society in Guam internalizes colonial conceptions about the land and women's bodies. In Agada Johnson's story, for example, what we get is this idea of women as patriotic, erotic, and sexualized bodies. But her unpublished writings really tell us stories otherwise. So again, these earlier forms of violence and how we can begin to think about these and begin to scrutinize how we have begun to internalize some of these conceptions, these colonial conceptions about the land and women's bodies, or prescribed roles for women, especially when we think about moral claims on women's bodies, ideas about purity, and about existing to be mothers in the image of the Blessed Mother. So I want to end there and kind of broach that as a way to perhaps for the Q&A and after Francine's presentation, maybe we can have an opportunity to discuss these things. Thank you.
That was really, really, really powerful for us to listen to, Siddus Masiti, for that presentation and just for your scholarly and community work. I know that it's really great having a book launch here and having the opportunity to hear more about, and we definitely will have time for Q&A. We've got some comments and questions coming in the chat. So one of the things that we can do as we're moving forward with thinking about those stories that you shared and the women, the healers, the nurses, how they maintain their practices, challenged new systems, worked within those systems. I think that's just such an important thing to the work that you've done, and to really honor those people who continue to be thinking about those stories or learning about those stories and the insight that they give us for what we're dealing with today as we think about self-determination and sovereignty today, right? So thank you. I'm gonna use this now to shift over to introduce our next speaker, our panelist, Dr. Franci Napati. And Dr. Francine, or as some of you might know her as Fran, MSN Napati, is a professor at the University of Guam School of Health. And she was previously a project coordinator for a National Science Foundation grant on endangered languages, and a researcher for the Commission on Decolonization self-governance study that we mentioned at the outset. Her research interests and her work are surrounding reproductive and sexual health in Guam, and she has presented her work at conferences focusing on Indigenous knowledge and well-being and Indigenous women. Dr. Napati received her doctorate degree from the University of Hawaii at Manoa, where her dissertation was titled Decolonizing Sex Education, Chamorro Epistemology as Liberatory Praxis. I know some other things I could share with you about Dr. Napati as my esteemed colleague, friend, and family member in the Napati clans, but tonight we'll just focus a little bit more on letting her do the work of sharing about how she cares deeply, not only about Guåhan's education and health, especially sexual education, but how that historical past that we've just heard it from Dr. Delisle can also help us inform what's going on in the future and currently today. So I'll turn it over to you. Thank you so much.
Siddus Masiti era, and hello everyone. Thank you for joining us. Thank you very much, Tina, for your presentation. I hope to really hone in on some of the things from your book that I think will help our audience tonight to really think about body sovereignty. Because as you were speaking, one thing we're noting is that body sovereignty a lot of the time becomes challenged at a policy level. And so we're noting that it becomes very much multifaceted, and that it happens whether through occupation, as I'm going to talk about a bit, kind of with what you were talking about with the Patera. And so really when the naval administration came in, so this is something that Tina talks about in her book, right? With regard to public health, US Navy policies were not simply about imparting habits of hygiene to safeguard Chamorros, but about wielding power and control over presumably infantilized and primitivized bodies. So when the naval administration came in and started really bringing in a lot of these general orders, what that meant to do, especially in the realm of public health, was to teach Chamorros how to be clean. And it was under the assumption that we were dirty and primitive and seen as even barbaric, which is how many, if not all, indigenous groups are seen throughout within the colonial imagination. So Dr. Anne Hattori, right, in her book Colonial Disease, which really traces that time period in which the naval government establishes its public health program and really starts to formalize the public health care infrastructure within Guåhan, one thing that starts to happen in this campaign is that in the cleaning of Chamorro bodies, and when I say clean, I mean that with quotes, right? In the cleaning of Chamorro bodies, it was really meant to also undo the effects of Spanish colonization. So Dr. Delisle in her book talks about how the Navy really didn't even think the Spanish did colonization well, right? They think they did it wrong. They had some things. So the Navy thought, oh, we need to help the Chamorros to better assimilate. We need to get them clean. We need to get them sort of more modernized, right? And modern is something that keeps coming up all the time. How do we modernize these barbaric and savage people? And so, of course, our bodies is one place where we start to really see this policing. And so within the realm of the Patera, right? So the Patera we know is honorable work. But at the time when many of these women started to become Patera, it wasn't seen as honorable. A lot of the time they were heavily scrutinized for the work that they wanted to do, even though today we congratulate our healthcare workers. It's seen as something that is very high status in doing that. It's very important work. It's things that we all acknowledge, like especially after this COVID-19 pandemic, we understand that our frontline workers were very significant in getting us through any sort of public health crisis. And so the Patera at this time were not given that sort, were not seen as honorable. For many of them, they were seen, I think Dr. Delisle in her book said some of them were akin to like the Dama de Noche, right? They were seen as these wandering women because Chamorro Patera were able to kind of navigate between the lines of being Chamorro, but then also having to exist within the naval Patera program or the licensing right of the Patera. And so they were seen as navigating those two cultural worlds. And so families at times exerted political and social dominance over their Patera relatives based on notions of heteronormative sexuality and promiscuity. And so the way they did that is very similar to what we see in the waves of feminism where we critique the working mother, right? If a mom decides to go to work or she needs to work, we often at times criticize her for not being there for her kids, right? We say that she doesn't give enough attention to her children. We say that if a mother's not there, it's going to be to the detriment of her child. And so we make it so that we create an impossible choice for women in that they can't be a mother and have a career. And so with the Patera, the same thing was going on. Patera were criticized for having to leave the home to go care for their patients. There was one account where one of the Pateras was talking about being in the middle of a delivery and helping her patient through childbirth, and she forgot to call her husband. And so she was saying that this happens to her all the time. But at the time when the Patera were starting to get licensed and really having to navigate these worlds, that was not okay, right? It was not okay to leave your children. And leave has such a negative connotation to it too, right? We think of it as abandoning them. That's what it was likened to. We saw them as abandoning their families. And so it creates that impossible situation. On the other hand of that, let's say a Patera did not have a family. So if you were young, you were unmarried, you were kind of, excuse me for my language, but this was kind of the discourse around this, but it kind of became this puta, right? The sort of puta narrative that came out. You were then seen as this woman who was free to do what she wanted, liberated, and could therefore become a dangerous woman because you had the ability to travel, you had the ability to be more independent. And so it was precisely because senior Chamorro women had the reputation of being strict. Only then did Chamorro families allow their daughters to enroll in nursing schools. So a lot of families did not want their daughters to become Pateras, especially if they were unmarried and they were young, because they thought that it was kind of exposing them to a very dangerous landscape. They thought that in exposing them to that kind of freedom, it would put their very body in danger. And so the only time they felt relief in that, they felt like their young relatives could take on this kind of work, was with the presence of the senior Chamorro woman. But even as Dr. Delisle was saying, this wasn't sort of this utopian situation in which you had this very mentoring Sina sort of younger Chamorro relationship. Oftentimes it became divisive in that there were even times where a younger Patera was seen as a threat because they could potentially push out the older Patera because of the way the Navy had set up a lot of this infrastructure. And so it becomes such a very complicated situation, which goes completely against the way that Chamorros really thought of age, right? We think of our Sina as people to respect. We think of our elderly as people that we need to learn from, and we hold them in very high regard. So when you begin to sort of pit them against each other, or even make it so that the two of them cannot be together harmoniously, it becomes a very difficult situation. So the Patera's careful and skilled negotiations of fraught spaces between home and field in service to Chamorro families is evidenced in the fact that often those who traveled far and wide to the Patera bypassed a hospital or clinic that was much closer. So we were policing the body of the Patera themselves, but in that we were also policing the work that they were doing, right? We were making it difficult so that people could not get access to public health in a way that was comfortable to them and allowed them to have their own bodily autonomy. And so Chamorros at the time, they decided, well, even with all this public health infrastructure coming up, we prefer to see the Patera. They know us, they are us. And so they'll be we'll be able to be very comfortable with them. We'll be able to be open with them. And then even as Tina was talking about, the Patera were not just there strictly for childbirth. They were there to kind of help women in any way that they needed across the spectrum of reproductive health care. And so because of that, Chamorro families were much more comfortable with going to Patera for their healthcare needs. And so even as modernity was kind of happening all around them and hospitals were being built and formal clinics and all this sort of infrastructure was coming up, families would sort of bypass that section of the island completely and go visit their Patera, even if it meant traveling further and further away. And so this policing is happening during the naval administration, but then we start to see a lot of this policing happening later, especially with a very hot topic that's been coming up with Bill 291 and sort of the politics of abortion here in the island. And so in 1990, right, we start coming now to the original Bill 848, which is introduced by Senator Elizabeth Areola. And so at the time, the pro-life camp, right, we're talking about body sovereignty, we're talking about the ability to decide for oneself. So the pro-life and the pro-choice camp, in Dr. Damas's article, when she starts really dissecting the abortion debates of the 1990s, what she starts to see is that there's a very common thread in terms of self-determination, right? What do we consider governing oneself and one body? How do we consider the governance of our island, the governance of our people? So on one end of the debate was the pro-life camp, right? So the pro-life camp, they believed that it was mainly based on the principle that we should protect life from conception until natural death. They also started to link the anti-abortion sentiments that were coming out with an anti-colonial agenda. And the way that they were saying this is that for those who were in favor of allowing abortions, they were therefore also in favor of allowing colonization. And the way they framed this was that this whole slogan of saving the fetus then started to become more and more synonymous with things like liberating Guam and saving the Chamorro people. So those on the pro-life camp, what they were saying was that if you wanted to truly decolonize and you wanted to self-determine, you needed Chamorro people to be there. You needed Chamorro people to be in existence. And so in order to preserve that, in order to preserve this population, they were saying that abortion should not be allowed. On the other end of that, the pro-choice camp was even was also engaging in the self-determination sort of aspect of it. And so they were saying that they believe that life should be defined according to a social and biological dimension. They also were saying that they valued motherhood, but felt that freedom for a woman means she should have the ability to make an informed choice about whether, when, and with whom they should have children. So they were kind of likening abortion laws to colonization, saying that by not allowing someone to make a choice about their body, about not giving someone the autonomy to make a public health decision, was therefore further colonizing what was already a colonial body to begin with, because this was happening within our territory. And so their argument then was that you need to give women this choice, just in the same way that we need to have the choice when it comes to our governance, right? Our decisions around governance. So when the hearings began, right? So as Bill 848 was coming to discussions within the legislative floor, Democrats on one side tried to compromise with the bill because the bill had actually no provisions to it, right? It was just saying that abortions across the board would be illegal. There would be no exceptions whatsoever. So Democrats then rallied and started to introduce Bill 842, which created compromises for abortion. It would permit abortion in cases of pregnancy due to rape, incest, or when the fetus is believed to be grossly deformed, as well as requiring advance notification of parents of minors. So at the hearing, about 1,500 people came to testify on behalf of the pro-life side, whereas only 300 people came to testify on the pro-choice side. So this is 1990, right? 2022, we saw the exact opposite. We're now seeing a majority of testimonies coming from the pro-choice side as opposed to the pro-life side. So, however, Bill 848 at this time was upheld, but with only a few revisions, and the bill only lasted 4 days. So kind of taking it back a bit, right? Before even the introduction of Bill 848, 12 years prior to that, kind of 5 years after Roe v. Wade. So Roe v. Wade ends up getting ruled in 1973. So in 1978, Senator Conception Barrett, what she decides to do is she decides to amend Guam's law to include a section that permits abortion by a physician on demand. So in Guam, that's the law that was upheld, right? Then we soon get Bill 848, which is introduced by Senator Areola. And so this bill gets passed through the legislature, but then it only lasts about 4 days because it's seen as not in any way aligned with Roe v. Wade, and so it gets taken off the books. So really at the end of the day, what ends up happening is both groups start to disband, right? So the pro-life group starts to disband, the pro-choice group starts to disband. And so what you're seeing is that basically the main highlight of the 1990 abortion debate really becomes the issue of self-determination. We really start to ask ourselves, how do we as a people talk about the governance of our body if we are not politically able to have that power? And so pro-life activists claim that if we have the right to abort, then we would be getting rid of future followers and members of the movement. Pro-choice activists, on the other hand, began to argue that we were becoming the colonizer by not allowing women the right to govern their own bodies. And so in framing it around self-determination, both parties found some common ground. They found that there would be no real way to really debate these sort of divisive issues around abortion or even reproductive rights or what it means to govern one's body because we had no political clout. And so it makes it very difficult to even begin to have these conversations when you yourself are not decolonized and you're not able to make those decisions as a people. So more recently, right, in talking about, so Vivian Dames, right, in her article, which was basically tracing this entire history that I was talking about, Chamorro women and the politics of abortion. She concludes the whole thing by saying an alternative local synthesis could not be achieved because of the American tendency, which Guam has adopted in its political culture and legal institutions, to frame social issues in terms of a clash of rights instead of drawing on an indigenous language of relationship and responsibility. So some of this rhetoric keeps coming out, right? It becomes a right of, is it the right of this over this? Is it the individual right? Is it a collective right? And so that conversation keeps coming in. But with Bill 291, especially of those of you in the audience who might have been following a lot of those testimonies that were coming out, a lot of people were starting to really draw on, we hear it a lot, right? We hear Nafet Malik come up all the time, this collective peace that our community has, but a lot of the time it's a misused, overused word. But a lot of the testimonies were really trying to draw on that spirit. And the way they were doing that was doing what Dr. Damas was talking about, an indigenous language of relationship and responsibility. Many of the testimonies were asking and begging senators to, instead of focusing on abortion rights, to instead focus on how to improve the community. Right? They were talking about it through initiatives around education, initiatives around helping survivors of domestic and sexual violence, survivors of rape, giving them actual access to services. They were talking about better access to contraception. And so these issues become so important because, as we saw with the reaction of the draft opinion of the Supreme Court choosing to overturn Roe v. Wade, there was also a lot of national rhetoric coming out about the possibility of what kind of ramifications such an overturn would have. So a lot of people were asking, if Roe v. Wade gets overturned, what does that do to reproductive health, right? How will that further impact the body? And so some of them are asking, is that going to impact our access to contraception? Well, that starts to call that into question. And so whenever this type of legislation happens, it creates such a divisiveness within the community that it makes it very hard for people to kind of listen to each other. And so Director of Bureau of Women's Affairs, Jane Flores, right, in the Familao Rights Rally, she had said most women do not want to make that choice for another woman, and they most certainly do not want lawmakers or any religious group making it. So the question then becomes, well, this is really the big question of body sovereignty, right? Who gets to decide what happens to someone's body? Is it an individual choice? Is it a societal choice? Who is responsible for making those choices? That's a huge question. We're not going to answer that tonight. We may not answer that for a long time coming, but it really does bring in this huge question of body sovereignty. What does that really mean? Juliana Flores Baza of Familao Rights, in the same rally, she had said, as our leaders, you are supposed to find common ground and draft legislation that moves this island forward with the times. This bill goes backwards and divides us. And there's a lot of truth to what Juliana is saying, in that this bill, as we saw with those hours and hours of testimony that the Guam legislature was televising, we were seeing that there was a lot of Black and white areas. There was nothing gray with this. A lot of it was a community member going against another community member, calling into question very personal things about the other person. And so what this bill was doing, it was dividing us further and further apart, making it very hard for us to have conversations about the other things that were coming up in the testimonies, as I mentioned, these other initiatives around reproductive health. And so it all became a battleground, really, in a lot of ways. And so that's very similar to what happened in 1990. It's very similar to what happens on a national stage, sometimes even on an international stage, when it comes to body sovereignty. Body sovereignty is something that is, it's personal, right? It's a very personal thing for all of us because it affects all of us. And so whenever you have these sort of conversations, it becomes very difficult to do so, especially within a colonial space. And so tonight, I know we talked a lot. We brought out a lot of information. A lot of it was very heavy, but I do thank you all for joining us. And I look forward to Q&A. Thank you for having me.
Viva, Siddus Masiti, to our two brilliant panelists. That was a lot of information, and we're getting some really great questions. So I'm going to go ahead and dive right back into them. The first question that came in had to do with Chamorro womanhood. What can we say about Chamorro womanhood once we get past the layers of colonialism? And I'd like to extend that a little bit further and ask, how do you imagine body sovereignty in an independent Guåhan? So what can we say about Chamorro womanhood once we get past the layers of colonialism? And how do you imagine body sovereignty in an independent Guåhan?
Sort of looking at Chamorro womanhood past these layers of colonialism. I mean, I know we're very weary of historical accounts, mainly because they're written by our colonizers, but there are a lot of tidbits that come out within the historical archive that tell us that many of our Chamorro women had autonomy, right? They had the ability to make decisions for themselves and for their families in a way that did not make it difficult and have them have to kind of pit themselves against their families or have to hide away from their decisions. So like one of my favorite sort of examples to use had a lot to do with the way we looked at relationships, right? Chamorros, we didn't have formal marriage, therefore we didn't have formalized divorce. And so we were free to kind of be in a relationship with each other and to dissolve that relationship just as quickly. And so today, a lot of that is heavily scrutinized, right? If you want to get a divorce, sometimes you're discouraged to do so because of it could potentially tear the family apart, is a lot of the narrative that comes around. If a couple is not married, they often get scrutinized for that as well. And so I think what we were seeing in a lot of the accounts is that Chamorro women it wasn't really so gender stratified in the way that it is today. Chamorros, we didn't place so much power on gender in the way that we do right now. And so we were much more about age stratification, right? And giving sort of roles to people and letting people participate in society and be involved in decision-making largely based on clans, the clan structure, and elders, right? And so we had like the Maga'taotao and the Maga'lahi. And so Chamorro women, I think, had a lot more autonomy. So like the Dama de Noche narratives of the Patera coming out, a lot of that I don't think would have existed. Sorry, what was the second part of that question?
How do you imagine, or what do you imagine body sovereignty to be in an independent Guåhan?
Well, I obviously have my own personal views of what body sovereignty will look like, but I do think within independent Guåhan, that's going to be a society thing to kind of contend with, right? So just like kind of like in the way we all talk about decolonization. So the first step is to vote, right? To have the plebiscite for us to choose a status. And then the way to really measure self-governance is our ability to decide how we want that government to look like. So it's not going to be my choice to make. That will be up to Guam, right? The Guam public to decide. Let's say we choose independence, right? And what do we consider body sovereignty? How would we like to give reproductive health care? What does that look like? There are way more progressive policies around very divisive issues around like reproductive health and abortion and things like that. And so all these policies can be adopted if Guam's ready for it.
Dr. Delisle, did you want to answer either of those questions?
I see a lot of questions coming through. I'll hold my thoughts and maybe I can weave those into some of the answers I have for some of the other questions.
Perfect.
That sounds good. Yeah, we've kind of curated a couple of different ones from ones that have come in. So this next set of questions actually has a couple of parts because some of our viewers have some questions about the terms and the usage of the terms. And so this might be a little bit more for you, Dr. Delisle. The first question is Patera an indigenous Chamorro word? And if not, do we know any of the titles that healers had before colonization? So that's one kind of component of the question. And we're also wondering, do we have lists and names of the women who worked as Patera? And last but not least, as part of this kind of terminology and wondering about these titles is, can you explain where the term Palawan Talon comes from? So some questions around that. I can repeat it if you want me to, but the first part was, is Patera an indigenous Chamorro word? And if not, do we know any of the titles that healers maybe had before colonization?
So the term Patera derives from the Spanish term partera, the Spanish word for midwife. It was really looking through some of the other, particularly Pali Ramon de Vera's dictionary and other, I'm forgetting actually, I'm forgetting, but some of the other terms, the older terms for Patera would be I'm sorry. In one of the oral histories that I had done with Ten Rosalia Ujua Mesa, it was really interesting because when she talked about the Patera work, she was talking about it relational in terms of relationality. The woman who can have a baby but chooses not, the woman who becomes pregnant, so that Patera has a relationship with the woman who chooses not to become pregnant, but then also has she assists the woman the expecting mother. But then she used the term it was the term nat fafanyagu, that the term to talk about the one who helps one deliver. And that I really picked up on because I was also in search of these very Tadung terms for the Patera, their titles, and also the work they did. The question about Palawan Talon, this is a term that I got from just talking to family members. And when I was doing some oral history work with the Heleta series under the Political Status Education Coordinating Commission between 1993 to 1996. And they were referring to these women who were going out in public like the Patera, not that they really believed they were Palawan Talon, because that has a very derogatory connotation. The word, it's like you could be called Palawan Talon, or as one Patera I interviewed said, Tankina Herrera, she said, sometimes the elders would call you puta, as Dr. Napati picked up on. And that was the worst thing that one could be called, even though Palawan Talon had a negative connotation, that one who betrays the family, who's not at home doing what she should do, these prescribed roles, but she was out gallivanting. And as Tankina reminded me in the oral history, we weren't doing that. We were working alongside the Navy men. We wanted to learn these new methods. We were also implementing and keeping up traditional practices. And that didn't make us any less authentically Chamorro. And that other question, I think there's one other question, Dr. Napati.
Yeah, there was the part of that was people were wondering if there were lists and maybe names of the women who worked as Patera. So
a good place a good start would be Karen Cruz's work on the Patera. It's a humanities Guåhan, at the time Guam Humanities Council publication. I actually usually keep that on my desk, but it's a small booklet that I believe Mark has a copy in the library, the Micronesian Area Research Center, in their reading room. It's a really good place to begin. It's not an exhaustive list as Karen mentions, but because there's clearly other stories of Patera. And one also wonders if, I heard this and as I asked around, no one could tell me the names, but some speculation that there were also male Patera. And I was not able to locate male Patera at the time that I was doing work in the 1990s oral histories, but that's something to consider.
Great, thank you so much. The next question we received is, how can we reconcile this position of a staunch placental politics point of view with the works and examples of other Maga'taotao scholars like the late Dr. Benedita Dunca, Gloria Nelson, and current scholars like Dr. Sauter, late Senator Elizabeth Areola, Dr. Rosa Carter, and the like? There seems to be a huge emphasis on this issue of body sovereignty as we discuss the dichotomy of the colonial versus anti-colonial, and the idea of a systemic intrusion and restriction of Western patriarchy in the Roe v. Wade era. Is it an either or thing, career versus motherhood? So it kind of goes on, and I think like the idea here is trying to get to the heart of the different positions that have been taken in our community. Is it an either or thing? Kind of seems to be the question that's being asked.
No, I don't think it's an either or thing. Dr. Sauter actually has a really good article where she talks about kind of the very power of motherhood and how in the thread of indigenous feminism that actually runs counter to a lot of the narratives that were coming out around white feminism waves. And so she talks about how for Chamorro women, we wielded a lot of the power of motherhood as a way of having sovereignty over our families and ourselves and being able to make decisions for our clans and for people that we cared and loved. And so that runs completely counter to what was happening with these narratives with the Patera, where it became this idea that if you wanted to work, you therefore had to leave the family, right? And had to leave them behind. And so by doing so, it becomes then a detriment to your family because their mother is not there. And I think a lot of women, Chamorro women today definitely contend with that because we hear some of that rhetoric. I know while I was going through graduate school, a lot of that would come up, especially as I had my kids. They would ask me, like there was an instance in which I believe like Ken had to do something and so did I. And so someone asked Ken, they were like, oh, well, where's Fran? And why can't she do it? And Ken's like, that's not a thing. Like Fran doesn't need to be the one to take care of the kids. Like I can take care of the kids and do my thing. And so I think that still comes up a lot, but I think through the generations, we very much have started to accept that you can do both. And a lot of that has to do with the support of your clan. And so in the days when the clan relationships were still very strong, and we still see a lot of that today, especially those who live in compounds, those who are raised by the Patgunbihas of our society, like many of us understand that mothering doesn't necessarily have to be just the mother, right? It can be your older female relatives, it can be your grandmother, it can be your Nina, it can be your auntie, whoever it is. And so we don't put that same sort of pressure on women as maybe what was happening in the very staunch assimilation that was happening during the naval administration, which made it very difficult for Patera to navigate. And so I don't think now it's an either or thing. Tina, you can jump in if you'd like, but I really don't think we're having to do that. However, that's not to say that it still doesn't happen. As I've just shared in my personal experience, it does come up, but it's quite rare. But there are still some people who have those ideas. And so as a result, it's still a way that women are policed in some aspects.
I wanted to speak to the question about how we can reconcile this position of a staunch placental politics with the work and examples of Maga'taotao scholars. And so the work is really, for one thing, I'll start with Dr. Laura Souter's work. It's really, it builds on the work of with and alongside the work of Dr. Souter's work that is, that takes us through this history of examining how women's power was usurped under Spanish colonialism first. And, you know, if we think about the institution, the indigenous institution of the Maga'taotao and early forms of Chamorro education, even to the extent and the way that marriage was a way of oppressing women and women's bodies and the regulation of women. And so it builds on that work. And it's also, you know, it's more about the complexity. Placental politics is really grappling with what might seem the seeming contradictions. On the one hand, being how can you be modern, but also be very steeped in Tadung Chamorro tradition? How can you, in terms of now, right? How can one proclaim to protect the familia, and then believe in pro-choice? I put that in quotes because I think what indigenous feminist theory, building on the work of scholars like Dr. Laura Souter, it gives us the tools to deal with the complexity and even to change the narrative of one that's not simply pro-choice or pro-life, but looking back at the history and paying particular attention to specific historical and political contexts. What may look like authentic Chamorro womanhood, for example, may look very different now. And in fact, I would argue that it does. You'll see some overlap, but I've heard women saying this in some of the conversations and debates, the heated debates when I was back home last week around the bill, for example. That's not Chamorro. That's really a white woman. But you know, indigenous feminist theory works. It builds on the scholarship of earlier Chamorro scholars. I know Dr. Laura Souter's work builds on feminist, many of the second wave feminist work, but we're building on top of that. And now you have a body of work produced by indigenous feminists who are steeped in the language and who are also trying to articulate these similarities with earlier forms of feminism, even white forms of feminism, in the ways that are legible to Chamorro culture and society. I really liked that quote that you picked up from Dr. Damas's work, Francine. I forgot about that quote, so thank you. That one around relationality and responsibility, those are constantly shifting. The terms of relationship and relationality are constantly shifting. And I think that's what indigenous feminist theory and placental politics which is my bid to articulate an indigenous feminist theory and practice. That's I put faith in that it's going to help us begin to look at these really messy contradictions.
Yeah, thank you for that. There is a friendly reminder that Dr. Delisle has a whole book on this subject. So we have lots of extra things that we could dive into. And I know we're just really, you know, getting into some of these complicated and dynamic issues today. So, you know, one of the things that you mentioned just now in your comments and also in your presentation slides, you had talked about the women, and some of those images were really powerful, just reminders to get us actually thinking and looking and thinking about the body and the way that it manifested in different ways or was policed or politicized, or, you know, those kinds of things. And so your presentation really gave us sobering reminders about the history of this island. And one of our questions that came in wants to know, did you find parallels between the treatment of Guam's people by the pre-war Navy to the way that it treats the people today? And a secondary kind of component of that question is wondering, were the Chamorro nurses actually paid less than their white counterparts? Sort of the same way that we've heard about Chamorro men who joined the Navy and received less in payment and compensation.
What was that first part, Tiara, if you don't mind
Oh, yeah, sure, no problem. Sorry, there's the question was, do you find parallels between the treatment of Guam's people by the pre-war Navy to the way that it treats people today? And the separate part of the question was about, another question that was submitted was about Chamorro nurses being paid less than their white counterparts. And
so I actually don't have the figures on what the nurse midwives were making, but I did hear in some of the oral histories that they were paid less than the American Navy nurses. I'm sorry, I don't have that figure. In terms of parallels, there are definitely a lot of parallels in terms of the Navy's perception about land, and how the Navy's perception about the idea of development, and that Chamorros were not using the land in productive ways. And so there's a lot of similarity, but there's also differences in terms of how, and this is a really, it's a big question. We can enter it from different angles, but the things that come to mind is when I think about the buildup, this is, as someone who's really invested in looking at gender and sexuality, the Navy, in terms of the buildup, it's very telling and interesting that the Navy would put in place, in the midst of the conversations and the debates about the buildup, two women, right? I don't know. I mean, if you all can remember. So there's Rear Admiral Shoshona, and before her, trying to remember her name, from Hawaii. And so I think the Navy was some people looked at it as a really good PR move, because by virtue of them being women, it would soften people to the buildup. And so that's why it's really important to pay attention to how gender operates. So in that sense, the Navy is not doing business as usual. I mean, the Navy, the military is also appropriating the language of stewardship, that and that's as a way to justify holding on to these lands. We're going to protect these spaces because they're going to be kept from the general public, and then we're going to take these initiatives to protect the endangered species. So I'll stop there.
Great. Well, that's about all of the major questions that we received today, but I think that we've really been able to tap into a lot of really important ideas, I think, extending beyond just body sovereignty, but also this idea of gender and the manipulation of gender throughout history. More importantly, I think the point that was made earlier about these are things that our community has to work together to figure out. And I think the conversations like this are really just the beginning, that, imagining an independent future for our island involves taking these issues that all of us seem to have many different strong opinions about and sometimes can feel divided about, and finding a place where we can come to an understanding. But at the end of the day, I think respecting and understanding everybody's individual choices within a communal setting is going to be something interesting to navigate as we decolonize, right? The notion that we come from a very communal society, but we have sort of been divided due to the various layers of colonialism at play is something I'm curious about continuing to explore. And I'm really grateful that we had this conversation to begin that exploration for Independent Guåhan, the organization, and I look forward to having many more like conversations. So thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you so much to our esteemed panelists today. As mentioned earlier, if you're curious about this topic and want to read more, Dr. Taitano Delisle's book, Placental Politics, is available online through Amazon, through the University of Guam Press, if you'd like to order it and pick it up locally. It's a really important book to explore, and especially if you're interested in this topic, I would say it's a great place to begin. So Siddus Masiti to her for her continued scholarship and writing. And we look forward to seeing you next month, where we will be looking again at sovereignty, but this time we will be looking at sovereignty of our air and waters. So we'll see you next month. Adios.
Thank you.